the examples of practicing righteousness, when you give, when you pray, when you fast. And then talking about relationships. Relationships of God and neighbor. Where's your trust? Is it in mammon or is it in God? And then we're in this section now where he says, you hypocrite. And the interesting thing about that is this is the one time of all of the uses of that word hypocrite where Jesus uses it to describe his insiders. All the other times he's talking about those who are his opponents, those who are outside, the Pharisees, the scribes, his critics, the leaders of his day that were standing in opposition to him. This is the one time where he uses the word hypocrite, where he's asking his own followers to examine their hearts. And it comes in this discussion of do not judge and behold the log that's in your own eye before you try to help your brother out the speck that is in his eye. And then this idea of asking, seeking, and knocking. We're going to delve into that today. And I have a goal of getting even into the golden rule today. You know how my goals kind of go sometimes, but here's the deal. We have this class, and next week we have Chris Emerson. I'm not going to put you in the uncomfortable position of trying to decide whether you're going to listen to Chris Emerson teach or you're going to listen to me teach, because we need to be kind to our guests.
Oh, yes. Gracious of you.
Wow. Oh yeah, I'm full of grace. I'm full of something.
Well, this is good. I would have picked you. Not.
No. So next week we will defer to the teaching of Chris Emerson. And so that will leave us with only one more class following that. So, unless, no, I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to say let's just keep going. Although we could fill another quarter. It was our objective to delve into and look and examine the iceberg beneath the surface, but we just barely scraped the surface yet when it comes to the sermon. But we are going to conclude our study week after next with the conclusion. So just to look at our outline, following the golden rule, that is the final point of the main body of the sermon. And then we will go into, we'll review that in just a moment. The sermon conclusion, which will be the conclusion. This will be week after next. The three warnings of the gates, the narrow and the wide, the warning of observing a tree, good versus bad, and then the wise man, foolish man, and the foundation parable. All right? All right. So that is our plan. So let's just back up a little bit. And remember that this section that we're in here in Matthew, the 7th chapter, is an interesting parallel from the previous text, the previous paragraphs that we were looking at. There is this parallel, an interesting parallel, where Jesus is doing this teaching, well, first by making this blanket prohibition. From the previous chapter, it is do not lay up treasures on earth. And then the eye parable, the eye is the lamp of the body. There are two things that are just incompatible, God and mammon. And then look at how God provides. We get it here into chapter 7. We find the same thing. A blanket prohibition, do not judge. A little eye parable. How do you look at your brother with a speck of sawdust in his eye and there's a log protruding out of your eye? You hypocrite. There's that one example of Jesus using that word for his insiders. And then he says, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not cast your pearls before swine. Two incompatible things. We'll talk just a little bit more about that. And then finally, how God provides. All right, so we were talking about judging last week. I just wanted to conclude with one more text for us to think about that, because it is a callback to the previous things that we've been talking about. And that is how Paul uses this idea of judgment in Romans, the 14th chapter and verse 10, when he says, but you, why do you judge your brother? Or you again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of God. So Paul, in his commentary, he makes this comparison, actually this equivalence of judgment is the same as contempt for your brother. So that whole section of do not commit murder, and I say unto you, you don't even say to your brother, you fool. You don't regard another with contempt. Paul kind of comes down to that same conclusion. And that maybe give us a little bit of insight about what judgment means here. We kind of struggled with defining that really well last week, and I'm continuing to struggle with identifying what kind of judgment is Jesus talking about. If he's saying, don't do this. Certainly we have to make evaluations. Certainly we have to make decisions. Certainly we have to think about what is right and wrong and proceed with our conscience on these things. We make judgments every day. But certainly we do not hold our brother in contempt. And that may be getting to the bottom of what that means. Jesus goes on to use this illustration of the metaphor of the marketplace and the way that you measure. So in the minds of the people, they would be thinking of a scale going to market, perhaps buying some grain. And classically there would be the standardized weights on one side of the balance scale, and then whatever you're purchasing on the other side. And you would have to trust that those weights were accurate. And a lot of times the merchants, in order to cheat the people, would lighten their standardized weights, and that was condemned as a terrible way to treat people. So in the way that you measure, it will be measured to you. So there's that concept that Jesus is driving home. How you treat somebody else matters. And the ethics and the virtues that you demonstrate in that case is certainly going to be very important. All right. And then we come to this little parable. This little parable of the guy with this log sticking out of his eye. This is the closest thing, by the way, that Jesus had in his teaching to an SNL skit. I mean, I can visualize this on Saturday Night Live. One of the actors saying, "Oh man, I've got something in his eye," and then this guy comes out on stage with this log sticking out of his eye. And says, "Well, let me help you with that." It's an absurd, hilarious picture, isn't it? The humor of the absurdity is what Jesus is illustrating here, and he's saying that in this realm of judgment, this is what it looks like. When you put yourself in this position of being a judge and you're completely blind about yourself. So Jesus is calling on us to have some self-reflection before we make judgments about other people. And in the judgments that we make about other people, you notice it's about helping them. It's not about condemning, it's about helping. And so even in our efforts to think that we might be helpful for somebody else, it's so very important that we first have this self-reflection in order for us to be effective in that process of helping someone else. Because otherwise, it's just a complete absurdity. For you to be blind to your own deficiencies and think that you're in a position to help somebody else with their minor flaws. So it's quite a picture of absurdity that Jesus is showing us here. And I think the object of it is that what he's doing here, he is redefining these relationships that we have with other people. And the relationship must be defined by this self-reflection. And only when we have the self-reflection can we see clearly to help somebody with their issue. And so it's a complete rehaul of understanding relationships and understanding ourselves in so many ways. And so he's redefining the interaction. So it's a completely absurd thing for somebody with these glaring flaws to put themselves in a position of helpfulness to somebody else. And Jesus says, take that log out of your own eye first. Then you can see clearly. See clearly. Yes, Steve.
Well, your sketch has the person saying, "Oh, I've got something in my eye," and he's almost like he's asking for help. But that doesn't seem to be what he's saying.
Right.
He's saying, "I've identified a problem in you that you don't see,
Yeah.
yet I've got similar, worse problems."
Yeah.
But don't we have to somehow moderate how we look at this? We take this and don't judge, and suddenly we can't tell anybody about any problem that they have because we have to be perfect, we have to have no log, and we have to not judge. So it must be something more about the heart and the attitude that we have going into it than, or else only perfect people. Only Jesus could remove splinters.
That leads us right into my thought question of the day. How do we know when it's right to make a judgment? Jesus blanketly said, do not judge, but we understand the nuance that Jesus teaches with, and the reality of life is we have to make judgments, we have to make a call, we have to make decisions, we have to have conclusions about things. How do we know? And how do we know when it's appropriate to help somebody with a speck in their own eye? And how do we know in this next section what it means to cast pearls before swine? How do we know? So there's all kinds of questions about that. So you had some input about that? Would you like to tell me? How do we know? Yeah.
I think my experience with living with Jan is an incredibly intuitive person. And literally, she's not quick to judge, but she's quick to discern the character and nature of other people. And then has this sense of warning about, I'll never forget with our niece having her second husband, introducing that husband to her. And I had apprehensions about it, but immediately she knew how that was going to play out. And years later, it was there. But young girl in love, how can you intervene in that circumstance? So it was very difficult. But I think if you have a discerning nature and you're able to observe people, the approach can be, is there something I can help you with? As opposed to, I've identified a problem with you. Is find out, do they have a sense of their own problem to begin with? Mm-hmm. And so, it's a challenge.
And it gets even more difficult when Jesus introduces these next metaphors to me. Well, Do not give what is holy to dogs. Do not throw your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Are we, Jesus, have you changed the subject here? He hasn't changed the subject. He's saying there's a decision for you to make. There's a discernment that you have to calculate in your interactions with other human beings. And sometimes the decision that you must come to is you are what? Withholding pearls. What are pearls in this metaphor?
Nuggets.
Nuggets. Pearls are valuable, right? Pearls are something that are esteemed in true value. Even in their day, they talked about pearls as being truth. We use the same expression today, pearls of wisdom. That's how they used it as well. So we understand what pearls are. These are truths. This is wisdom from God. Why would I withhold that from anybody? Yeah, Bob.
I'm going to go to Romans
Okay.
and chapter 1, verse 21, verse 21.
All right.
This is talking about these people that would be, in my estimation, the swine or the dogs would be. Even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, in their minds. Their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of an incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, birds, and creatures. And so there is an approach where if you bring the truth to that person, their heart is darkened and their mind is futile, and it probably is counterproductive at that point. And my whole idea when I see somebody who's in desperate circumstances is to try to lighten the heart first before bringing that pearl of truth.
Yeah. So, don't give what's holy to dogs. All right. Holy, that, again, that's kind of a, some have suggested this is the genius of Jesus. You take these and the applications are universal in so many ways. You can get just as specific as you want to, but the applications are a multitude. So don't give holy what is to dogs. Don't give pearls to pigs. So holy and pearls are equivalents, and dogs and pigs are equivalents. The idea of dogs and pigs in the mind of Jesus listeners, that's just about the lowest of low, right? This is, as Jews, these were unclean animals, okay? Certainly they weren't to eat either one of these animals, but even coming into contact with these animals would defile them in so many ways. And they would use these terms to talk about Gentiles a lot. The ultimate outsiders are dogs and pigs. Now, our culture is not exactly like this, but we can get a handle on this. We love our dogs, right? We have an affection for dogs. In the Jewish mind, think more about a feral dog, a wild dog that is a danger to you. That is what you should be thinking about when you read this. And that was what would come to their minds. This is something that could bring disease, something that could bring harm to you in some way. And it's certainly somebody that is an outsider of Judaism. And so they would use those words to conjure up those types of ideas. It's interesting that Jesus would go ahead and describe some Jews in this way, especially with the Pharisees and the scribes. He would describe them as dogs, as outsiders, as dangerous, as harmful. And so to understand then that we don't give what is holy to the dogs. Do you know one of the immediate applications that people made of this in the first century? Was communion. Somebody comes into your assembly and you're observing communion, you do not offer what is holy to somebody who has not been baptized. That was that was one of the first applications that they made of that. But Jesus said the consequences are not just in relationship to holy things. The consequence of this is that it can turn bad for you because you are demonstrating a lack of wisdom and understanding what the reaction of people is going to be. So when Jesus sends out in the limited commission, he says, if people reject you, what do? You shake the dust off of your feet and you move on. You don't insist that they accept the wisdom that you're offering. You move on. And so that's the kind of the same concept that we have here. So you don't waste your time with pearls before. Pigs don't have any appreciation for the value of pearls. You want to impress a pig, go and show them your lovely jewelry. And what do? They'll trample it into the mud and muck. And the same is true for people who have that dark heart, who have no appreciation for God. And you're trying to provide pearls for them, and it might even stimulate anger in them, is what Jesus is saying here. So Jesus first says, do not judge, but now he's saying, make an evaluation. Be discerning. Well, how do we know? Jesus, how do we know? Get this.
You have to know the person's son, so you can apply some wisdom. The counter example of that is the internet, where people are just arguing at each other, and they don't even know each other. It's just somebody on a screen.
Yeah.
And we're just blasting out. I wouldn't be so bold to say it's all wisdom and pearls, but it's that's the approach doesn't work. So you have to know the person, at least.
Yeah. Don't judge, but be discerning. Jesus, you're blowing my mind. So how do we know? I think Jesus answers the question in these next verses, in beginning of verse 7. Ask, and it shall be given to you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it shall be opened. Or what man is there among you, when his son shall ask him for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he not give him a snake? Really? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more shall your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? He's breaking into a discussion here of prayer, obviously, right? I thought we already talked about prayer. Jesus, you gave us the model prayer. You gave us some instruction about that. Jesus, some authors describe this as teaching in concentric circles. It's interesting to think about how Jesus taught. But we have so many callbacks to previous things. But in this particular context of do not judge, but be discerning, he brings up prayer. Now, let me just throw this out there. I've been wanting to say this for this whole quarter, actually, and never have gotten to this point. I hope you're enjoying the James class on Wednesday. And I hope that you're discovering, if you haven't already, that James is a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. It really is. There's no... I won't even debate that with you, because it really is. The themes that James discusses come directly from these concepts. James I believe, was one of those who memorized these lessons of Jesus. Or maybe he heard these lessons from his mother, like Jesus did. You ever think of that? Could be. But just as an example, just look at James 1 with me, just really quickly here. And just be impressed with this, just for a minute, would you please? That James 1, beginning in verse 5. James is making a commentary on this very section that we just read. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. Or let not that man expect he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man and unstable in all of his ways. That is a direct commentary on this point that Jesus is making. Ask, and the God who loves to provide for his children will give it to you. What James is saying here is that in this context of Jesus talking about prayer and asking, we're talking about difficult relationships. We're talking about conflicts between human beings. And what should be our request? I need wisdom in dealing with people. And that makes the most sense in this particular context, that as Jesus is talking about navigating difficult relationships and how we're going to be effective. How are we going to know when we're dealing with a pig or a dog? How are we going to know whether we should help somebody with that speck in their eye? How are we to know when we are to make a judgment? I need wisdom. I need wisdom for God to help me with that. You remember Solomon back in 1 Kings, the 3rd chapter. God said, ask what you want. And what did you remember specifically what Solomon asked for? It wasn't necessarily wisdom. He wasn't wise enough to ask for wisdom, was he? What did he ask for? He said, well, I'm just a child. Let me see if I can just get here really quickly and see if we can get to the bottom of this. I'm a little child, he says in verse 7. I do not know how to go out or come in, and thy servant is in the midst of thy people, which thou hast chosen, a great people who cannot be numbered or counted for multitudes. So give thy servant an understanding heart to judge people. What? That sounds like what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew 7. The heart to judge people is what Solomon asked for. And we say, well, he asked for wisdom. Yeah, he did. And that's what God concluded. Because you have asked for wisdom, this ability to judge in your relationships with people, I'm going to give you wisdom. And what else? You didn't ask for riches, and you didn't ask for power, and you didn't ask for success. Listen to this. But all these things will be added to you. All of these things shall be added unto you. From the Sermon on the Mount in 1 Kings. How about that? How about that? So Solomon wasn't even wise enough to ask for wisdom, but God said, yeah, you're getting at it. That is the heart that I'm looking for, the humble child who understands I need to be wise. Jesus gets to that. Ask and it shall be given to you. And as you think about that progression, first there is the request. Ask and it shall be given. But then what? Seek. That's more active than asking, right? That's somebody who is more determined to receive something. He's seeking it. He's actively pursuing it. And that proceeds then to knocking, which indicates a persistence in that. You're asked, you're seeking, you're knocking, and it just keeps going from there. That is what Jesus said is going to help you to know when to be in a position of judgment, to know when you're helping somebody with a minor flaw, to know when you're casting your pearls before swine. You ask God to help. And God's willing to help you. He's the generous Father. And he uses a bit of hyperbole here. He said, you're evil. You're evil fathers. You're evil parents. And your child makes a request for food. Who's going to give him a stone? Are you going to do that? How cruel would that be? You're going to say to your child, I know you're hungry. Here you go. What a terrible parent. Is that who God is? Or is he going to pull out his bag of tricks and give you a snake? That's not the God we serve. And Jesus is saying, you know instinctively, innately, as human beings made in the image of God, you have this moral intuition about yourselves, what it means to be a parent. You need to apply that to your God, who is your parent. What you already instinctively understand about what it means to be a good parent, apply that to your understanding of who God is. Jesus. Sometimes I just shake my head. I don't know what to say. He's just brilliant. It's just brilliant. Oh, I could say something else. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but you understand who God is because you know who you are. So be that kind of person who asks in that kind of way. Okay, what about I've asked and I didn't get it? That's a bit of a rabbit hole. I don't know if I want to go down that one either, but here's the objection that people have. Well, that's inconsistent with my experience. I've asked and didn't get it. I've persisted in asking and didn't get it. Does God really love me? James had something to say about those things as well.
I was going to say, didn't James say something like that?
he did. He did indeed.
Well, the end of verse 11 also is, Father in heaven, give what is good to those who ask him. And so God, don't question God's wisdom in response to your request.
Oh man, we're almost out of time. Let me just say it, but we can't get into the golden rule. We'll have to save that for our last class. But we've prayed. Let's just bring this home. I've prayed for a marvelous preacher to come and be part of this church. I've prayed it a lot. I've sought it. I've knocked on that door. And it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. Does God not love me? Does he not really want to give me what I think I need? Because that's what I think we need. That's not the answer that God has given to that prayer up to this point, is it? His answer has been, well, here's some other opportunities for you, Glen Springs Church. there is evangelism taking place in Africa for somebody that you have a great deal of confidence in, support that work. There's other opportunities where your spirit of evangelism can be fulfilled without you getting what you think that you need, which is this marvelous pulpit presence that we think we need. We need to rethink our needs, maybe, and maybe come to the conclusion that God is telling me what my needs are, and He has provided for these needs. And we need to praise Him for that and for the opportunities that He's presented to us, and maybe redefine what our needs are based on what the answers to our prayers are. That's a bit of meat to chew on for this week. So thank you for your good attention.